The Kursk salient, early July 1943. Across a bulge in the Soviet lines stretching 200 kilometers wide and 150 kilometers deep, 2 million men prepare for what will become the largest armored clash in human history. The summer air hangs heavy over the rolling steppes of central Russia, thick with the knowledge that something unprecedented approaches. In fields of sunflowers and grain, beneath a cloudless sky, the greatest concentration of tanks, artillery, and soldiers ever assembled face each other across no man's land. The war has turned. 6 months earlier, the German 6th Army surrendered at Stalingrad, breaking the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. 2 months ago, the last Axis forces in North Africa capitulated. Now, in the summer of 1943, Adolf Hitler demands one more decisive victory in the East, one final blow to shatter Soviet resistance and regain the strategic initiative. The place he chooses is Kursk. The operation he orders is codenamed Zitadel. The stakes could not be higher. If Germany succeeds, the Red Army's momentum halts and the Eastern Front stabilizes. If Germany fails, the road to Berlin opens. The bulge in the Soviet lines is no accident. Soviet intelligence knows the attack is coming. For months, agents inside Germany and intercepted communications have revealed German intentions. Rather than withdraw and straighten their lines, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and his commanders make a calculated decision. They will stand, dig in, and turn the Kursk salient into a killing ground. They will absorb the German assault in elaborate defensive preparations, then unleash a counter-offensive to destroy the Wehrmacht's remaining armored strength. The defenders dig, fortify, and wait. The German forces assembling for Operation Zitadel represent the finest equipment and most experienced soldiers the Third Reich can produce. Massive concentrations of armor, including the newest tank designs, prepare to smash through Soviet lines in a classic pincer movement from north and south. The plan appears simple. 2 powerful drives will meet at Kursk itself, encircling and destroying Soviet forces trapped inside. On paper, it looks like the blitzkrieg victories of 1941 returning once more. The Soviet defenders possess even greater strength in numbers and have spent months preparing to receive the blow. Millions of soldiers occupy the salient and the reserves behind it. Thousands of tanks stand ready. Thousands of aircraft wait. The Red Army has transformed the entire region into a fortress. Every village becomes a strong point. Every hill conceals artillery. Every approach is covered by fire. The defenders know the Germans must come through or abandon the offensive entirely. There will be no room for maneuver, no opportunity for sweeping encirclements. This will be attrition warfare on a scale never before seen. What hangs in the balance extends beyond military considerations. For Germany, this offensive represents perhaps the last chance to avoid inevitable defeat. The war economy strains under Allied bombing. Defeats in Africa and the Atlantic erode Axis strength. The invasion of Italy looms. If Operation Zitadel fails, Germany loses its capacity to conduct major offensive operations in the East. For the Soviet Union, the opportunity is equally profound. If the Red Army can break the Wehrmacht's armored fist at Kursk, nothing stands between Soviet forces and the borders of Germany itself. The initiative, once lost in June 1941, can finally return. The atmosphere in those early July days crackles with tension. German soldiers inspect their equipment, check ammunition loads, and write letters home. Many are veterans of previous summers in Russia, and they sense something different this time. The element of surprise is gone. The enemy expects them. Soviet soldiers peer across the lines at German positions, watching dust clouds raised by massing panzers. They test weapons, arm defenses, and prepare for the onslaught they know will come with the dawn. One German tank commander later writes, "We all knew this was different. The Russians were ready for us, waiting, and our advantage of surprise was lost. We were driving into a prepared killing ground, but orders were orders." The largest tank battle in history is about to begin. In 2 weeks of combat so intense that survivors will speak of it in whispers for the rest of their lives, the fate of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the entire war, will be decided in the fields and villages around an obscure Russian city. The Battle of Kursk opens on July 5, 1943, and nothing will ever be the same. The strategic situation on the Eastern Front in the spring of 1943 presents Germany with an unprecedented dilemma. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, the Wehrmacht stands on the defensive along most of the front. The catastrophic loss of the 6th Army at Stalingrad in February still reverberates through German high command. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's counter-offensive in March recaptures Kharkov and stabilizes the southern front. But this victory only delays the inevitable question: can Germany still win this war? The Kursk salient exists because of Soviet overreach during the winter offensive. Pushing westward after Stalingrad, Soviet forces drive deep into German-held territory around Kursk, creating a massive bulge in the lines stretching roughly 200 kilometers from north to south and 150 kilometers into German territory. Both sides recognize the tactical problem it creates. For the Germans, the salient represents a tempting target for encirclement. For the Soviets, it offers a potential springboard for future offensives, but also creates vulnerability. Adolf Hitler seizes upon the Kursk salient as the objective for Germany's summer offensive. In April 1943, he issues Führer Directive No. 6, ordering Operation Zitadel. The goal appears straightforward. Army Group Center attacks southward from the Oral salient, while Army Group South drives northward from Belgorod. The two pincers meet east of Kursk, trapping Soviet forces in a massive encirclement. Hitler believes this victory will restore German prestige and create conditions for negotiated peace. The delay proves fatal to German chances. Originally scheduled for May, Operation Zitadel suffers repeated postponements. Hitler insists on waiting for new Panther tanks and Ferdinand tank destroyers to arrive at the front, wanting technological superiority to compensate for growing Soviet numerical advantages. Each week of delay allows the Red Army more time to prepare. German commanders argue bitterly. General Heinz Guderian opposes the operation entirely. Field Marshal von Manstein believes success requires an immediate May launch. By the time Hitler sets the attack for early July, the window of opportunity has closed. Soviet intelligence penetrates German planning from the beginning. The Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, agents inside German high command, and ultra-intercepts from Bletchley Park all provide details of German intentions. By late April, Soviet Supreme Command knows not only that Germans plan to attack the Kursk salient, but also the general outline of the offensive. Marshal Georgy Zhukov presents Joseph Stalin with two options: withdraw from the salient and straighten the lines, or remain in place and prepare elaborate defenses. Stalin chooses to stand and fight. The defensive preparations become the most extensive in military history. 8 separate defensive belts stretch across the salient, with some positions reaching depths of 300 kilometers behind the front lines. The first belt consists of extensive minefields, anti-tank ditches, bunkers, and concealed artillery positions. Each subsequent belt mirrors this pattern. Soviet engineers lay over 1 million mines in the northern sector alone. Anti-tank strongpoints appear every few kilometers, each designed to channel German armor into predetermined killing zones. Every village transforms into a fortress. The construction effort staggers the imagination. Civilian laborers and military engineers work throughout May and June, digging nearly 5,000 kilometers of trenches and constructing over 20,000 gun emplacements. The Red Army moves entire factories' outputs to the salient: anti-tank guns, artillery pieces, ammunition by the trainload. Soviet commanders study German tactics from previous campaigns and design defenses specifically to counter blitzkrieg methods. For Germany, Army Group Center under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge deploys the 9th Army commanded by General Walter Model. Model's force includes 23 divisions, among them 6 Panzer divisions and 1 Panzer Grenadier division, totaling approximately 335,000 men. In the south, Army Group South under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein commits even greater strength. The 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth and Army Detachment Kempf total approximately 350,000 men and 11 Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions. Manstein organizes his assault around the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, containing the elite Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions with the newest equipment. The Soviets deploy overwhelming defensive strength. The Central Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky faces Model's northern attack with 711,000 men, over 5,000 artillery pieces and 1,200 tanks. The Voronezh Front under General Nikolai Vatutin confronts Manstein's southern thrust with 625,000 men and over 1,600 tanks. Behind both fronts, the Steppe Front under General Ivan Konev waits in reserve with 573,000 men and over 1,500 tanks. The equipment represents the peak of wartime production. Germany brings its newest tanks, the Panther with its long 75mm gun, the Tiger heavy tank with the feared 88mm gun, and the Ferdinand tank destroyer with heavy armor but lacking defensive machine guns. These technological marvels appear alongside hundreds of proven Panzer Mark IV tanks. The Luftwaffe concentrates over 2,000 aircraft. Soviet armor relies primarily on the T-34 medium tank, the war's most produced tank and arguably the best balanced design. The Soviets also deploy increasing numbers of KV-1 and IS-2 heavy tanks. Soviet Eid-Bats artillery parks include the fearsome Katyusha rocket launchers. 3,000 Soviet aircraft wait to contest German air superiority. The final preparations in late June and early July reveal the approaching storm. German reconnaissance flights photograph Soviet positions but cannot detect the true defensive strength. Soviet partisans sabotage German rail lines, delaying supplies and reinforcements. Both sides issue extra ammunition, emergency rations, and medical supplies. The mood among German forces mixes confidence and apprehension. Veterans remember stunning victories of 1941, but also the brutal winter battles and endless Soviet resistance. Officers briefing their men emphasize German armor and training quality, but few mention attacking positions the enemy spent 2 months preparing. Soviet morale stands higher than at any point since the war began. Stalingrad proved the Wehrmacht could be defeated. The soldiers manning the defenses know they fight on their own soil. Political officers remind them of German atrocities in occupied territories. One Soviet artillery officer later recalls, "We counted the days until the Germans attacked. We knew they were coming. We knew where. We knew approximately when. For once, we were ready. For once, we would make them pay for every meter." One German panzer officer writes in his diary, "The Tigers and Panthers are impressive machines, better than anything the Russians have, but we are driving into a fortress that had 2 months to prepare. I wonder if technology alone will be enough this time." The final hours before the offensive see feverish activity. German artillery crews range their guns, tank crews load ammunition and fuel, infantry check weapons, Soviet troops man their positions in trenches and bunkers, artillery observers prepare to call down fire, anti-tank gun crews ready for point-blank engagement. Everyone knows dawn on July the 5th will bring fire and steel unlike anything yet seen. The Battle of Kursk stands ready to begin. In the north, Model's assault divisions coil like springs. In the south, Manstein's panzers mass for breakthrough. Between them, Soviet defenders grip their weapons and wait. The largest tank battle in history is hours away. At 2 o'clock in the morning on July the 5th, 1943, the German offensive begins not with the main assault, but with a Soviet spoiling attack. Soviet artillery opens fire on German assembly areas in both sectors, having identified exact locations through reconnaissance and intelligence. For 30 minutes, Soviet guns pound German positions, hoping to disrupt the attack before it starts. The bombardment causes casualties and damages equipment, but fails to prevent the offensive. The main German artillery preparation commences at 3:30 in the morning in the southern sector. Field Marshal von Manstein's assault divisions faced the Voronezh Front's 6th and 7th Guards armies. Over 1,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously, creating a rolling barrage across Soviet positions. The earth trembles. Explosions tear through the pre-dawn darkness. The bombardment lasts 90 minutes, expending thousands of tons of high explosive. At 5 o'clock, as the artillery barrage lifts, the panzers roll forward. The 4th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hermann Hoth, spearheads the southern assault. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps forms the main striking force. 3 elite divisions, advancing on a narrow front of barely 30 kilometers. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division on the right, Das Reich in the center, and Totenkopf on the left. Their objective lies 40 kilometers north, the town of Prokorovka and the open country beyond. The German armor advances in waves. First come the heavy Tigers and Ferdinands, their thick armor designed to absorb Soviet anti-tank fire, while their powerful guns eliminate defensive positions. Behind them, Panthers and Panzer Mark IVs follow, ready to exploit any breakthrough. Infantry mounted in half-tracks accompany the tanks, prepared to clear Soviet trenches and strongpoints. Overhead, Stuka dive bombers and Focke-Wulf fighters provide close air support. The Soviet response proves immediate and devastating. As German tanks emerge from their start lines, Soviet artillery observers call down fires. Within minutes, hundreds of guns open fire on pre-planned defensive fire zones. Shells rain down on advancing German columns. Katyusha rocket launchers add their distinctive howling salvos. The Germans push forward through the barrage, accepting casualties as the price of maintaining momentum. The first defensive belt consists of extensive minefields covered by anti-tank guns and dug-in infantry. German tanks detonate mines, throwing tracks or destroying wheels. Engineers rush forward under fire to clear lanes, but Soviet machine guns and mortars inflict heavy casualties. The Tigers and Ferdinands prove largely immune to mines designed for lighter vehicles, their weight simply crushing through. But the explosions slow the advance and channel the armor into narrower corridors. Soviet anti-tank guns open fire at ranges of 1,000 meters or less. The 45mm guns prove ineffective against Tiger frontal armor, their shells bouncing off harmlessly. But the heavier 76mm guns score kills, especially against the Panthers, whose side armor remains vulnerable. Soviet tank hunters emerge from concealed positions, teams of infantrymen carrying anti-tank rifles and satchel charges, stalking individual German tanks. The Leibstandarte Division, commanded by SS General Theodor Wisch, makes the fastest initial progress. Advancing northeast toward the village of Berezov, the division's Tigers spearhead the assault. One company of Tigers destroys an entire Soviet tank battalion in the first hours, knocking out over 30 T-34s while suffering minimal damage. The combination of superior German optics, crew training, and armor protection creates a killing ground. By midday, on July the 5th, the southern assault has penetrated the first Soviet defensive belt across most of the attack frontage. German forces advance between 5 and 10 kilometers, destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks and guns. But the cost proves higher than anticipated. Dozens of German tanks sit immobilized by mines or mechanical failure. Soviet anti-tank guns, fighting to the death, knock out Panthers and Panzer IVs. The Ferdinands, lacking defensive machine guns, prove vulnerable to Soviet infantry attacks. The Das Reich Division, pushing north toward Yakovlevo, encounters particularly fierce resistance. Soviet infantry of the 52nd Guards Rifle Division refuse to retreat, fighting from trenches and bunkers even as German tanks roll past. The SS troops dismount to clear Soviet positions in brutal close-quarters combat. Flamethrowers burn out bunkers. Grenades fly back and forth across cratered ground. The division advances 7 kilometers by nightfall, but leaves hundreds of casualties behind. Soviet defenders employ tactics specifically designed to counter German armor. Rather than meeting panzer attacks in open tank battles where German superiority dominates, Soviet units allow German armor to advance into prepared killing zones. Anti-tank guns positioned in depth open fire at closer ranges, where even lighter guns can penetrate side and rear armor. Soviet tanks remain concealed in hull-down positions, invisible to advancing Germans until the last moment. By nightfall on July the 5th, the southern assault has achieved limited success. The 4th Panzer Army penetrates between 10 and 15 kilometers into Soviet defenses across a front of 30 kilometers. 300 Soviet tanks lie destroyed or abandoned. But the breakthrough has not occurred. The 2nd and 3rd Soviet defensive belts remain intact. German losses exceed expectations. 50 to 60 tanks destroyed or damaged in the first day alone. Hundreds of infantry casualties. Mechanical breakdowns plague the new Panthers. The night brings no respite. Soviet aircraft bomb German assembly areas and supply columns. Soviet artillery fires harassment missions throughout. The night. Soviet engineers work frantically to repair damaged positions and lay additional minefields in the gaps created by the day's fighting. German tank crews perform emergency repairs by lamplight, welding damaged tracks and replacing road wheels. July the 6th sees the German offensive resume with undiminished intensity. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps continues pushing north, now engaging the 2nd Defensive Belt. The fighting grows even more savage as Soviet defenses deepen. The village of Yakovlevo becomes a charnel house as Das Reich forces clear it building by building. Soviet snipers exact a toll on German infantry. Anti-tank guns positioned in stone buildings fire at point-blank range into German armor. The Totenkopf division, advancing on the Corps' left flank, encounters massed Soviet armor for the first time. Elements of the 1st Tank Army move forward to counterattack the German penetration. Hundreds of T-34s, supported by heavy KV-1s, surge toward German positions. The ensuing tank battle rages across open fields south of the Pisel River. German Tigers and Panthers engage Soviet tanks at long range, destroying T-34s before the Soviet tanks can close the distance. But Soviet numbers tell. For every T-34 destroyed, 2 more appear. The battlefield becomes a nightmare landscape. Burning tanks send columns of black smoke into the summer sky. Destroyed vehicles litter the fields. Shell craters pockmark the earth. Dead and wounded soldiers from both sides sprawl across contested ground. The smell of burning fuel, explosives and death hangs over everything. Temperatures soar, adding heat exhaustion to combat casualties. Dust raised by thousands of vehicles reduces visibility. By July the 7th, the southern assault has advanced approximately 20 kilometers into Soviet defenses. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps fights through the 2nd Defensive Belt and engages the 3rd. But the pace of advance slows dramatically. Soviet resistance stiffens with each passing kilometer. Fresh reserves arrive from the steppe front to plug gaps. Soviet artillery fire intensifies as German forces advance within range of additional gun positions. The conditions for German soldiers become increasingly desperate. Constant combat without adequate rest exhausts crews and infantry alike. Ammunition consumption exceeds projections, forcing rationing. Medical services strain under the flood of casualties. The promised rapid breakthrough appears increasingly unlikely. German commanders report to Manstein that Soviet defenses prove far stronger than intelligence estimated. Soviet commanders recognize that their defensive strategy is working. The Germans are bleeding themselves white against prepared positions. Every kilometer costs the Wehrmacht tanks and men it cannot replace. Soviet losses, while staggering, can be absorbed. Soviet industry produces more tanks in a month than Germany manages in a quarter. One SS tank commander later writes, "The Russian defenses had no end. We would overrun one position, destroy dozens of their tanks, and immediately encounter another defensive line with more tanks, more guns, more infantry. It was like fighting a hydra. For every head we cut off, 2 more appeared." A Soviet tank officer recalls, "We lost many tanks, many good men, but we held. Every hour we delayed the fascists was a victory. We knew reinforcements were coming. We knew we only had to hold a little longer." By July the 8th, the German southern assault has penetrated nearly 25 kilometers into Soviet defenses, but remains 40 kilometers short of Prokorovka. The offensive has not failed, but it has not succeeded. The race is now between German offensive power and Soviet reserves. Manstein commits additional divisions, feeding them into the battle to maintain momentum. Soviet commanders do the same. The largest tank battle in history is building toward its climax. July the 9th through the 11th witnessed the German offensive reaching its crisis point in both sectors. In the south, Manstein's forces continue grinding forward toward Prokorovka, but the advance slows to a crawl measured in meters rather than kilometers. In the north, Model's assault has stalled completely against defenses even more formidable than those in the south. The Wehrmacht is fighting two separate battles, and neither approaches the decisive breakthrough German planners envisioned. The southern sector continues to see the fiercest combat. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, having penetrated approximately 30 kilometers into Soviet defenses by July the 10th, approaches the critical crossroads near Prokorovka. This small town, insignificant in peacetime, now represents the gateway to open country beyond the Soviet defensive belts. If German armor can seize Prokorovka and break through, Manstein's forces can turn north and race toward Kursk itself, potentially completing the southern half of the planned encirclement. Soviet High Command recognizes the danger and commits the 5th Guards Tank Army to prevent this breakthrough. General Pavel Rotmistrov commands the 5th Guards Tank Army, a powerful formation held in reserve for precisely this moment. The army contains over 800 tanks and self-propelled guns, including hundreds of T-34s and numbers of the new heavy tanks. On the night of July the 11th to 12th, Rotmistrov receives orders to launch a massive counterattack against the 2nd SS Panzer Corps at Prokorovka. The objective? Smash the German spearhead, halt the offensive, and begin pushing the invaders back. Soviet intelligence estimates German tank strength at approximately 300 to 400 vehicles in the Prokorovka area. Rotmistrov plans to overwhelm them with numbers and aggression. Dawn on July the 12th, 1943, breaks clear and warm over the fields southwest of Prokorovka. At 8:30 in the morning, Soviet artillery begins a massive bombardment of German positions. For 15 minutes, thousands of guns pound suspected German assembly areas. Then, at 8:50, hundreds of Soviet tanks surge forward in waves, advancing toward German positions at maximum speed. The 5th Guards Tank Army attacks in dense formations, presenting a spectacle of armor unprecedented even in this war of mechanized giants. The ensuing battle becomes the largest single-day tank engagement in military history. Approximately 1,200 tanks and assault guns clash across a battlefield measuring barely 15 square kilometers. The Germans, expecting to continue their own advance northward, instead face a tidal wave of Soviet armor. SS tank crews engage targets as fast as they can acquire them. Tigers and Panthers destroy T-34s at long range, their superior guns and optics providing a killing advantage. But the Soviet tanks keep coming, closing the range where German advantages diminish. Rotmistrov's tactics deliberately neutralize German superiority. Rather than engaging in long-range duels where German guns and armor dominate, Soviet tanks race toward German positions at full speed. T-34s charge forward in groups of 10 or 20, accepting horrific losses to close within 500 meters, then 200, then point-blank range. At these distances, Soviet 76mm guns can penetrate Tiger side armor. Soviet tank commanders ram German vehicles when ammunition runs out or guns jam. The battlefield dissolves into chaos, with Soviet and German tanks intermingled, firing at ranges so close that some crews engage with pistols and submachine guns. The fighting reaches an intensity that defies description. Tanks explode as ammunition cooks off, sending turrets flying meters into the air. Crews bail out of burning vehicles only to be cut down by machine gun fire. Smoke from hundreds of burning tanks reduces visibility to almost nothing. Commanders lose control of their units as radio communications break down in the electronic chaos. Individual tank duels occur at ranges of 50 meters or less. The noise of engines, gunfire, and explosions becomes a continuous roar. The summer heat combines with the fires to create temperatures inside tank compartments that approach unbearable levels. Soviet losses prove catastrophic. By day's end, Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army loses approximately 300 to 400 tanks destroyed and another similar number damaged. Entire battalions cease to exist. Some T-34 companies suffer 80 to 90% casualties. German gunners destroy Soviet tanks in groups, sometimes knocking out 5 or 6 vehicles with as many shots. The slaughter of Soviet armor at Prokorovka rivals the worst defeats of 1941. But unlike those earlier disasters, the Soviet attack achieves its strategic objective. It stops the German advance. German losses, while significantly lighter, prove equally decisive. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps loses approximately 50 to 70 tanks destroyed and over 100 damaged. More critically, the Corps exhausts its offensive power. The 3 SS divisions that began Operation Zitadel with nearly 400 tanks between them now field barely 200 operational vehicles. Crew exhaustion, mechanical breakdowns, and combat damage have eroded German fighting strength to the point where further major offensives become impossible. Manstein's spearhead has been blunted. The battlefield after Prokorovka resembles an industrial graveyard. Hundreds of destroyed and damaged tanks litter the fields. Many burn for hours, ammunition continuing to explode. Bodies of tank crews lie scattered among the wreckage. The charnel smell of burned flesh, diesel fuel, and explosives hangs over the landscape. Both sides evacuate wounded and attempt to recover damaged vehicles under cover of darkness. German recovery. Teams work frantically to tow damaged Panthers and Tigers back to repair facilities, knowing each vehicle represents weeks of production. Soviet recovery teams do the same, salvaging what they can from the wreckage. While the Battle of Prokorovka rages in the south, the northern sector presents an equally grim picture for German hopes. General Model's 9th Army, attacking southward from the Ural salient toward Kursk, makes even less progress than Manstein's forces. Model's assault, beginning on July the 5th with the same artillery preparation and armoured spearheads as the southern attack, runs into Soviet defences that prove even more formidable than those facing the 4th Panzer Army. The Central Front under General Rokossovsky prepared its defences with particular thoroughness. Intelligence warnings about German intentions gave Soviet engineers extra time to fortify the northern sector. Minefields stretch for kilometres. Anti-tank ditches channel German armour into predetermined killing zones. Every village has been transformed into a fortress. The 13th Army, defending the main axis of Model's attack, dug in with over 3,000 anti-tank guns and mines numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Model's forces include the 47th Panzer Corps, spearheaded by the Panther tanks of the 10th Panzer Brigade. The Panther, Germany's newest tank design, makes its combat debut at Kursk. On paper, the Panther represents a war-winning weapon, sloped armour, a powerful 75mm gun, good speed and mobility. In reality, the Panthers prove mechanically unreliable. Transmissions fail under the stress of combat. Engines overheat. Final drives break. Of the 200 Panthers deployed with Model's army, half are out of action due to mechanical failures within the first 3 days of combat. The German advance in the north measures progress in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. By July the 7th, Model's forces penetrate barely 10 to 12 kilometers into Soviet defenses, less than half the distance achieved by Manstein in the south. Soviet defensive tactics prove devastatingly effective. Anti-tank guns engage German armor from concealed positions, destroying tanks before German crews can identify the threat. Soviet infantry infiltrates around German spearheads, attacking supply columns and command posts. The battlefield becomes a series of isolated combats rather than a fluid breakthrough. The Ponyry railway station, a seemingly insignificant collection of buildings northeast of Kursk, becomes the focal point of some of the war's most savage fighting. Model commits the 2nd and 9th Panzer Divisions to seize Ponyri, believing its capture will open the route to Kursk. Soviet defenders of the 2nd Tank Army and 16th Tank Corps transform Ponyri into a fortress. For 6 days, German forces assault the station in repeated attacks. Tigers and Ferdinands grind forward through minefields and anti-tank fire. German infantry storm trenches and bunkers in hand-to-hand combat. Soviet defenders counter-attack repeatedly, throwing German forces back. Buildings change hands multiple times. By July the 11th, Ponyri remains in Soviet hands, and Model's offensive has effectively stalled. The disparity between northern and southern progress forces difficult decisions on German high command. Hitler, monitoring the battle from his East Prussia headquarters, grows increasingly frustrated. The promised encirclement and destruction of Soviet forces in the Kursk salient appears unattainable. Model's stalled offensive in the north means that even if Manstein breaks through in the south, there will be no northern pincer to complete the encirclement. The operation degenerates from an ambitious double envelopment into a grinding attrition battle that favors Soviet numerical superiority. Soviet reserves continue flowing into the battle from the steppe front and other formations. Fresh divisions arrive to replace units mauled in the fighting. Tank losses, while severe, are replaced with new vehicles from factories beyond the Urals. Soviet artillery ammunition stockpiles, built up over months of preparation, remain adequate despite massive consumption. The Red Army is trading space and casualties for time, knowing that every day weakens German offensive power while Soviet strength rebuilds. The cumulative toll on German forces by mid-July becomes unsustainable. The 9th Army in the north loses over 20,000 casualties and 200 tanks in 1 week of combat. The 4th Panzer Army in the south suffers 15,000 casualties and 300 tanks destroyed or damaged. German infantry divisions are ground down in the brutal close-quarters fighting. The Luftwaffe, initially achieving air superiority, finds Soviet air resistance stiffening as reinforcements arrive. German aircraft losses mount, and pilot exhaustion degrades performance. External factors now intrude on Hitler's calculations. On July the 10th, Allied forces land in Sicily, opening a new front in the Mediterranean. Italian resistance collapses, threatening the entire Axis position in southern Europe. Hitler faces strategic choices: continue Operation Zitadel despite mounting costs and diminishing prospects, or terminate the offensive and redeploy forces to meet the Mediterranean crisis. His generals present divided opinions. Manstein argues that the southern assault can still achieve breakthrough if given several more days. Model reports that his northern attack has no prospect of success. Guderian reiterates his opposition to the entire operation. July the 12th, the day of Prokorovka, marks the operational climax of the Battle of Kursk. While the massive tank battle rages southwest of that small town, Soviet forces launch their own offensive in a different sector entirely. The Western Front and Bryansk Front strike at the Ural salient, the very base from which Model launched his attack. This Soviet counter-offensive, Operation Kutuzov, threatens to encircle Model's entire army if it continues pushing south toward Kursk. The strategic tables have turned. The Germans, who began Operation Zitadel intending to encircle Soviet forces, now risk encirclement themselves. Hitler, receiving reports of the Allied landings in Sicily and the Soviet counter-offensive against Ural, summons his commanders to a conference on July the 13th. The discussion proves heated. Manstein argues for continuing the southern assault for several more days, believing breakthrough remains possible. Model requests permission to withdraw to defend against the Soviet attack on Ural. Hitler, influenced by the Mediterranean crisis and the threat to Ural, makes his decision. Operation Zitadel is cancelled. The offensive that was to restore German fortunes in the east is terminated after 8 days of combat. The cancellation order proves controversial. Some German commanders believe that several more days of attacks might have achieved breakthrough in the south, though Soviet reserves make this doubtful. Others recognize that continuing the offensive risks catastrophic losses for minimal gains. Historians debate whether Prokorovka decided the battle or whether Model's failure in the north and the Soviet Oral Offensive made German defeat inevitable, regardless of events at Prokorovka. What remains undisputed is that after July the 13th, Germany never again launches a major offensive on the Eastern Front. One German tank officer later writes, "Prokorovka was chaos beyond description. We destroyed hundreds of their tanks, but they kept coming. When the order came to break off the attack, I felt both relief and frustration. We had come so close, yet never close enough." A Soviet tank commander remembers, "Half my battalion died at Prokorovka. We drove straight at the fascist tigers, knowing most of us would die, but knowing we had to stop them. When night fell and we still held the field, we knew we had won. Not the battle, but the war. They would never advance again. The turning point has passed. The German offensive has failed to achieve its objectives. Soviet defenses have held, absorbed horrific punishment, and stopped the Wehrmacht's last major attack. Now the initiative passes permanently to the Red Army. The question is no longer whether Germany can win in the east, but how long it can delay inevitable defeat. The cancellation of Operation Zitadel on July the 13th does not end the Battle of Kursk. Instead, it marks the transition from German offensive to Soviet counteroffensive, a shift that transforms the strategic situation on the entire Eastern Front. Hitler's order terminates the assault, but does not authorize immediate withdrawal. German forces must hold their positions while simultaneously responding to the massive Soviet attack on the Oral salient that began on July the 12th. The Soviet counteroffensive unfolds in phases designed to exploit German weakness and prevent any reorganization of defensive positions. Operation Kutuzov, the assault on the Oral salient north of Kursk, involves 3 Soviet fronts with over 1,300,000 soldiers, supported by over 3,000 tanks and 21,000 guns. The objective extends beyond simply pushing German forces back. Soviet commanders intend to destroy Model's army entirely and liberate the city of Orel. The Soviet attacks begin with devastating artillery barrages. Thousands of guns open fire simultaneously on German positions, delivering concentrations that overwhelm defenses. The bombardments last hours, systematically destroying German fortifications, command posts, and supply dumps. Soviet aviation, now achieving numerical superiority as the Luftwaffe disperses to meet multiple threats, bombs German rear areas and interdicts supply routes. German forces, caught between the need to defend against Soviet attacks and Hitler's insistence on holding ground gained during Zitadel, face impossible demands. Units that spent 8 days attacking southward must now defend against Soviet forces attacking from the north and east. Exhausted soldiers, short of ammunition and replacements, man positions against fresh Soviet divisions. Tank units with 50% or fewer operational vehicles face Soviet armored formations at full strength. Model's 9th Army conducts a fighting withdrawal from its positions south of Orel. The retreat, beginning in mid-July, proceeds under constant Soviet pressure. Soviet forces pursue aggressively, attempting to cut off German units and transform the retreat into a rout. German rearguards fight desperate delaying actions at river crossings and key road junctions. Tigers and remaining Panthers anchor the defense, their heavy armor exacting a toll on pursuing Soviet tanks. But mechanical breakdowns and fuel shortages force the abandonment of numerous vehicles. The retreat reveals the full extent of German losses during Zitadel. Fields and roadsides lie littered with destroyed and abandoned equipment. Burned-out tanks, knocked-out assault guns, damaged trucks, and shattered artillery pieces mark the route of retreat. German graves appear by the hundreds, hastily dug and marked with simple crosses or helmets on rifles. Abandoned supplies testify to the Wehrmacht's diminishing logistical capacity. In the southern sector, Manstein's forces face similar pressure. On August the 3rd, Soviet forces launch Operation Rumyantsev, a massive counteroffensive aimed at liberating Belgorod and Kharkov. The Voronezh Front and Steppe Front, reinforced and resupplied, attack German positions with over 1 million men and over 2,000 tanks. The 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf still recovering from the battering received during Zitadel, cannot hold. Soviet forces recapture Belgorod on August the 5th in fierce street fighting that leaves much of it in ruins. The advance continues toward Kharkov, the industrial city that changed hands multiple times during the war. Manstein, recognizing that holding Kharkov risks encirclement of his entire force, requests permission to withdraw. Hitler initially refuses, declaring Kharkov a fortress to be held at all costs. Manstein ignores the order and begins evacuating the city on August the 22nd. Soviet forces enter Kharkov on August the 23rd, finding a city devastated by years of occupation and combat. The fighting during the Soviet counteroffensive proves as savage as the German assault. Soviet forces accept massive casualties to maintain momentum. Tank brigades charge German defensive positions, suffering losses of 50 to 60% to achieve breakthroughs. Soviet infantry storms German strongpoints in human wave attacks that sometimes succeed through sheer weight of numbers. The Red Army's willingness to pay the butcher's bill, combined with growing tactical proficiency and overwhelming material superiority, drives German forces steadily westward. The liberation of Oral on August the 5th provides the Soviet Union with its first major victory of the summer, and a propaganda triumph to rival Stalingrad. Stalin orders celebratory artillery salutes in Moscow, the first such salutes of the war. The recapture of Orel and Belgorod demonstrates that the Red Army can not only defend but also attack successfully, driving German forces back and liberating Soviet territory. The psychological impact on both sides proves profound. The final casualty figures for the Battle of Kursk and subsequent Soviet counter-offensives reveal the battle's terrible cost. Soviet losses total approximately 800,000 killed, wounded and missing from July the 5th through August the 23rd. Tank and assault gun losses exceed 6,000 vehicles, though many are recovered and repaired. The human cost staggers the imagination, yet Soviet manpower and industrial reserves absorb these losses and continue growing stronger. German losses, while smaller in absolute numbers, prove strategically decisive. Total casualties approach 200,000 killed, wounded and missing. Over 1,500 tanks and assault guns are lost, including many of the newest and most capable vehicles. Aircraft losses exceed 1,000 machines. More critically, these losses cannot be replaced. German industry, hampered by Allied bombing and resource shortages, cannot match Soviet production rates. The Wehrmacht that retreats from Kursk is fundamentally weaker than the army that began Zitadel, while its Soviet opponent grows stronger with each passing month. The battlefield itself, stretching across thousands of square kilometers of central Russia, becomes a vast graveyard. Hundreds of destroyed tanks rust in fields where they met their end. Artillery craters pockmark the landscape. Shattered villages, burned forests, and cratered roads testify to the battle's intensity. Unexploded ordnance litters the ground, claiming civilian victims for years after the fighting ends. German forces establish new defensive lines west of their starting positions, having traded Soviet territory gained in 1941 and 1942 for nothing but casualties. The front stabilizes temporarily in early September as both sides pause to reorganize. But the strategic situation has fundamentally changed. Before Kursk, Germany retained theoretical capacity to launch major offensives in the east. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht can only defend, trade space for time, and hope for a negotiated peace that will never come. Manstein and Model, two of Germany's most capable commanders, recognize the strategic implications. Both men understand that Kursk represents not merely a tactical defeat, but a strategic catastrophe from which Germany cannot recover. In private communications and post-war memoirs, both acknowledge that after Kursk, German strategy in the east reduces to delaying inevitable defeat rather than achieving victory. One German general later reflects, "Kursk was the end of German offensive power in the east. We threw our best divisions, our newest tanks, our finest soldiers against prepared defenses, and we failed. After Kursk, we could only retreat, slowly at first, then faster and faster, all the way back to Berlin. A Soviet staff officer writes, "The fascists came to Kursk believing their tigers and panthers would save them. They learned that courage, determination and numbers matter more than technology. We paid a terrible price, but we stopped them, and once stopped, they never advanced again." By September 1943, the Battle of Kursk and its aftermath conclude. The largest tank battle in history ends with complete Soviet victory. The Red Army has defended successfully, counterattacked decisively, and liberated significant territory. The road west, toward Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and ultimately Germany, lies open. The war in the east enters its final phase, the long, bloody advance from Kursk to Berlin. Behind the strategic statistics and operational analyses lies a human catastrophe of staggering proportions. The numbers compiled in military records tell only part of the story. Behind each casualty figure lies an individual tragedy, a family destroyed, a community devastated, a future erased. The wounded present horrific injuries characteristic of mechanized warfare. Tank crews suffer burns over much of their bodies when ammunition explodes or fuel ignites inside their vehicles. The burns, often third degree, cover faces, hands and torsos, creating injuries that 1940s medicine struggles to treat effectively. Many burn victims die of infection or shock in the days following injury. Those who survive face months or years of painful recovery and permanent disfigurement. Infantry soldiers suffer from shell fragments, bullets, and blast injuries. The high explosive artillery shells used in massive quantities at Kursk create wounds no surgeon of earlier wars encountered. Massive tissue destruction, multiple fragment wounds, traumatic amputations. The immediate aftermath of major tank battles like Prokorovka reveals scenes of indescribable devastation. Hundreds of burned-out tank hulks litter fields across square kilometers. Bodies of crew members lie scattered around destroyed vehicles, killed while attempting to bail out or shot down after escaping burning tanks. The summer heat accelerates decomposition, and within days the stench of death hangs over the battlefield. Both sides organize burial details to inter the dead, but the numbers overwhelm available manpower. Many bodies receive only hasty burial in shell holes or mass graves. Proper identification proves impossible for most casualties. Dog tags melt in fires, uniforms burn away, and many bodies are damaged beyond recognition. Soviet prisoners taken by German forces during the battle face transport to camps in occupied Poland or Germany, where conditions remain deliberately lethal. Nazi racial ideology views Slavic peoples as subhuman, and Soviet prisoners receive treatment reflecting this murderous worldview. Starvation rations, inadequate shelter, brutal labor conditions, and systematic murder kill most Soviet prisoners within months of capture. German prisoners in Soviet hands face years of captivity in harsh conditions, with many not returning home until the 1950s. Civilian casualties in the Kursk region prove difficult to calculate precisely, but certainly number in the tens of thousands. The civilian population in the salient and surrounding areas suffers from artillery bombardment, aerial bombing, combat sweeping through villages, and deliberate atrocities. Villages caught between advancing and retreating armies are destroyed, their inhabitants killed in crossfire or deliberately murdered. Soviet civilians accused of collaboration face execution when the Red Army recaptures territory. German forces murder civilians suspected of partisan activity or simply to create terror. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are rendered homeless by the fighting. Villages throughout the combat zone burn to the ground, victims of artillery fire, aerial bombing, or deliberate destruction. Peasant families who survived German occupation now face the task of rebuilding from nothing. Homes are destroyed, livestock killed or stolen, crops trampled by tanks and burned by combat. Refugees flee combat zones with whatever possessions they can carry, creating streams of displaced persons that overwhelm Soviet civil authorities. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors, both military and civilian, proves profound and lasting. Soldiers who endure weeks of continuous combat without adequate rest experience, what contemporary medicine calls shell shock or battle fatigue, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men break under the strain of constant artillery bombardment, witnessing the deaths of comrades and living with the daily possibility of their own violent death. Soviet military medical services, focused on physical wounds, provide little treatment for psychological casualties. Civilians who survived the battle carry their own trauma. Children witness horrors no child should see, parents killed, homes destroyed, violence on a scale that shatters innocence. Women endure sexual violence from both German occupiers and increasingly from Soviet soldiers as discipline breaks down under combat stress. Elderly residents who survived previous wars and revolutions face yet another catastrophe that destroys communities and ways of life. The immediate days and weeks after the battle see desperate efforts to care for the wounded and bury the dead. Soviet military medical services evacuate hundreds of thousands of wounded to rear area hospitals, a logistical challenge of staggering proportions. Hospital trains carry wounded soldiers away from the front, their boxcars filled with men on stretchers stacked 3 high. Many die during evacuation, their wounds too severe, or infections too advanced. Those who reach hospitals face surgery performed under primitive conditions, with inadequate anesthesia and antibiotics. Burial details work for weeks, clearing battlefields of corpses. The summer heat makes this work particularly grim. Bodies decompose rapidly, and the stench forces burial parties to work in short shifts. Soviet dead receive hasty burial in mass graves, often with minimal ceremony. Chaplains being scarce in the atheistic Red Army, political officers sometimes offer ideological speeches over graves, but frequently even this formality is omitted. German dead are buried separately when possible, though during intense combat, expediency dictates mixed burials of both nationalities. The landscape itself bears permanent scars. Forests are reduced to shattered stumps by artillery fire. Fields are cratered and littered with unexploded ordnance that will kill civilians for decades. Villages are leveled, leaving only charred foundations and rubble. Roads are destroyed by bombing and deliberate demolition. The infrastructure of civilian life across thousands of square kilometers lies in ruins. Orphans number in the thousands. Children whose parents died in combat or were murdered by occupation forces wander battlefields and refugee columns seeking food and shelter. Soviet authorities eventually gather these orphans into state institutions, but in the immediate aftermath, many survive through scavenging and begging. The sight of homeless children becomes commonplace in recaptured territories, a testament to war's capacity to destroy not just the present, but the future. Families across the Soviet Union and Germany receive notification of deaths, wounds, or missing status. The bureaucracy of death overwhelms administrative capacity on both sides. Many families receive no official notification for months or years. Others receive incorrect information. The absence of information creates agonizing uncertainty. Wives do not know if they are widows. Parents cannot mourn sons whose fates remain unknown. The psychological toll of this uncertainty compounds the grief of confirmed loss. One Soviet medical orderly later testifies, "The wounded came in endless streams. We ran out of morphine, out of bandages, out of everything. Men died on the operating tables not because we could not save them, but because we lacked the most basic supplies. The screaming never stopped." A German chaplain recalls, "I buried so many young men that I lost count. 18-year-old boys who should have been starting university or learning trades, instead dying in a Russian field for a war already lost. I stopped asking God why. There were no answers." The Battle of Kursk's immediate aftermath creates a humanitarian crisis of overwhelming proportions. The medical services, burial details, and refugee assistance systems of both sides strain beyond breaking point. the scale of suffering defies adequate response. In years to come, survivors will struggle to explain what they witnessed to those who were not there. Many will carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, constant reminders of those terrible weeks in the summer of 1943, when the largest tank battle in history turned the fields of central Russia into an inferno of steel and death. The Battle of Kursk stands as one of World War II's decisive engagements, a turning point from which Germany's strategic position in the east never recovers. The battle's significance extends far beyond the immediate tactical outcome of one German offensive repulsed and one Soviet counteroffensive succeeding. Kursk represents the moment when the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passes irreversibly from Germany to the Soviet Union, transforming the character of the war from a contest with uncertain outcome to an inexorable Soviet advance toward Berlin. The immediate strategic impact proves devastating for Germany. Operation Zitadel's failure consumes the Wehrmacht's last major offensive capability in the east. The panzer divisions committed to the assault, Germany's premier striking force, emerge from the battle as shadows of their former strength. Tank losses, while replaceable in theory, cannot be replaced at rates necessary to rebuild these formations to offensive capability. More critically, the loss of trained crews, each representing months of expensive instruction, erodes the qualitative advantage German armoured forces previously enjoyed. Future German operations in the east will be purely defensive, fighting a series of delaying actions against an enemy growing stronger with each passing month. The destruction of German offensive power at Kursk enables the Soviet Union to seize and maintain the initiative for the remainder of the war. Following the victory at Kursk, the Red Army launches a series of massive offensives that drive German forces steadily westward. The liberation of Ukraine begins in autumn 1943. Belarus follows in summer 1944. By January 1945, Soviet forces stand on German soil, preparing for the final assault on Berlin. None of these subsequent operations would have been possible had Germany achieved breakthrough at Kursk and destroyed significant Soviet forces in a successful encirclement. The political consequences extend beyond the Eastern Front. Germany's failure at Kursk, combined with the Allied landing in Sicily in July 1943 and subsequent Italian capitulation, demonstrates to neutral nations and wavering allies that the Axis cannot win the war. Turkey, which Germany courted throughout the war, maintains its neutrality and eventually joins the Allies in February 1945. Finland, Germany's co-belligerent against the Soviet Union, begins seeking a separate peace, eventually signing an armistice in September 1944. The strategic isolation of Germany accelerates as former allies and potential partners recognize inevitable German defeat. The military lessons learned at Kursk profoundly influenced subsequent Soviet operations. The defensive tactics employed successfully against Operation Zitadel, multiple defensive belts in depth, massive mine concentrations, anti-tank strongpoints and aggressive counterattacks become standard Soviet defensive doctrine. When adapted for offensive operations, these lessons inform the massive Soviet offensives of 1944 and 1945. The Red Army learns to coordinate armor, artillery, infantry, and air power in combined arms operations that systematically destroy German defensive positions. The operational art demonstrated in Soviet planning and execution after Kursk represents a fundamental transformation from the Red Army that suffered catastrophic defeats in 1941. German military lessons from Kursk prove harder to implement. German commanders recognize that attacking prepared Soviet defenses with inadequate surprise and insufficient force produces nothing but casualties. The value of the new Tiger and Panther tanks becomes apparent, but so do their limitations. Mechanical unreliability, excessive fuel consumption, and vulnerability to close-range infantry attacks. German tactical doctrine adapts toward defensive operations, emphasizing mobile reserves and armored counterattacks rather than sustained offensives. But these adaptations cannot overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages: declining manpower, inadequate production, fuel shortages, and the inexorable arithmetic of a two-front war. The human cost of Kursk echoes through Soviet society for generations. The massive casualties, while absorbed by Soviet manpower reserves, represent permanent losses of fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers. Every Soviet family touched by the war, and few remain untouched, carries the burden of loss. The demographic impact of Soviet war casualties, including Kursk, manifests in reduced birth rates, gender imbalances, and a generation scarred by trauma. Soviet commemorative culture elevates Kursk to legendary status, celebrating the victory while acknowledging the terrible price paid. Veterans of Kursk receive special recognition in Soviet society, though many carry psychological wounds they never discuss. For Germany, Kursk represents the beginning of the end on the Eastern Front. The Nazi regime's propaganda attempts to portray the battle as a defensive success, claiming inflated Soviet casualties while minimizing German losses. But German soldiers and civilians increasingly recognize the truth. Letters from the front, though censored, convey the reality of a war being lost. The German home front, subjected to intensifying Allied bombing throughout 1943, faces the prospect of total defeat. The July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler partly reflects military officers' recognition, informed by disasters like Kursk, that Germany cannot win and that continued fighting produces only additional destruction. The Battle of Kursk is remembered today through memorials, museums, and annual commemorations in Russia and other former Soviet republics. The battlefield itself, preserved in places and built over in others, attracts historians, veterans in declining numbers, and those seeking to understand this pivotal moment. The memorial complex at Prokorovka, site of the climactic tank battle, features a bell tower visible for kilometers across the steppe, commemorating the Soviet soldiers who died there. Museums in Kursk, Oral, and Belgorod display artifacts recovered from the battlefield: rusted tank parts, helmets, weapons, and personal items belonging to those who fought. Different nations remember Kursk differently, reflecting divergent historical narratives and political contexts. In Russia, Kursk stands as one of the great patriotic victories, proof of Soviet resilience and eventual triumph over Nazi aggression. The battle features prominently in Russian military education and popular culture. In Germany, Kursk receives less public attention than Stalingrad or the final battles for Berlin, but military historians recognize its significance. The failure at Kursk confirmed that Germany could not achieve victory through offensive operations, and that the Eastern Front would consume the Wehrmacht in a war of attrition it could not win. Western historians initially underappreciated Kursk's significance, focusing primarily on Western Front operations and viewing the Eastern Front through the lens of Cold War politics. As Soviet archives opened in the 1990s and scholarship improved, Western understanding of Kursk's pivotal role deepened. Modern military historians recognize Kursk as perhaps the single most important battle on the Eastern Front after Stalingrad, the moment when Germany's last realistic hope of avoiding total defeat disappeared. The lessons Kursk offers extend beyond military history into broader questions of strategy, leadership, and the nature of industrial warfare. The battle demonstrates that technological superiority alone cannot overcome numerical disadvantage, poor strategic planning, and an enemy fighting on home soil with total commitment. German technical advantages in tank design, crew training, and tactical expertise proved insufficient against Soviet advantages in numbers, industrial production, and strategic depth. The Wehrmacht's failure to achieve surprise, the delay of Operation Zitadel to await new equipment, and the commitment of forces to an operation lacking realistic prospects of strategic success all reflect failures of strategic judgment at the highest levels of German command. For the Soviet Union, Kursk validates the defensive strategy advocated by Marshal Zhukov and other commanders. The decision to stand and fight at Kursk, absorbing the German assault in prepared defenses rather than withdrawing to shorter lines, proves correct. The alternative strategy of withdrawal might have preserved Soviet forces from casualties, but would have surrendered the initiative and allowed Germany to dictate the terms of engagement. By forcing Germany to attack prepared positions, Soviet commanders turned German strengths into weaknesses and Soviet numerical advantages into decisive factors. The battle also demonstrates the terrible cost of total war between industrialized nations. Over 1 million casualties in 6 weeks of combat, thousands of tanks destroyed, tens of thousands of civilians killed or displaced, and entire regions devastated. These figures illustrate warfare's capacity for destruction when waged without limits. The Eastern Front in general, and Kursk in particular, represent warfare at its most absolute. Two ideological systems, each viewing the other as an existential threat, committed to total victory or total defeat, with no middle ground possible. The question of whether Kursk was inevitable or whether different German decisions might have produced different outcomes occupies historians to this day. Had Operation Zitadel launched in May rather than July, would Soviet defences have been less formidable? Had Hitler accepted Guderian's advice and cancelled the operation entirely, could German forces have been better positioned to defend against Soviet offensives? These counterfactuals, while interesting, cannot change what actually occurred. The historical reality is that Germany attacked at Kursk in July 1943 with forces inadequate to achieve objectives, against an enemy thoroughly prepared and possessing overwhelming defensive advantages, and suffered a defeat from which it never recovered. The legacy of Kursk persists in modern military thought. The battle serves as a case study in defensive operations, demonstrating how a numerically superior defender, employing defense in depth, can defeat a technologically advanced attacker. Military academies worldwide study Kursk when teaching operational art, logistics, combined arms warfare, and the relationship between tactical engagements and strategic outcomes. The battle's lessons about the importance of intelligence, the value of operational reserves, and the need to match operational objectives with available forces remain relevant. For those who lived through it, both those who fought and those who survived in the combat zones, Kursk represents a trauma that shapes the remainder of their lives. Veterans carry physical scars, missing limbs, burn injuries, wounds that never fully heal. They carry psychological scars, nightmares, survivor guilt, inability to speak about what they witnessed. Civilians who endured the battle as children grow into adults, shaped by early exposure to violence and loss. These personal legacies, transmitted through families and communities, ensure that Kursk's impact extends far beyond military and political history into the realm of human experience and memory. The Battle of Kursk, viewed from the perspective of 8 decades later, stands as a hinge upon which the Second World War turned. Before Kursk, Germany retained theoretical capacity to stabilize the Eastern Front and perhaps negotiate some form of settlement short of total defeat. After Kursk, only total defeat remained possible, and the only question was when and at what cost. The road from Kursk leads inexorably to Berlin, to the bunker where Hitler commits suicide, to the final capitulation in May 1945. Every Soviet soldier who dies liberating Eastern Europe, every German city reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, every refugee displaced, and every family destroyed in the war's final 2 years, all trace their origins in part to that summer of 1943, when the largest tank battle in history decided the fate of the Eastern Front. As one historian later writes, Kursk was not the beginning of Germany's defeat. That occurred at Moscow in December 1941, or Stalingrad in February 1943. But Kursk was the end of any possibility that Germany might avoid total defeat. After Kursk, the question was not whether Germany would lose, but how long the dying would take. The fields around Kursk, Prokorovka and Orel grow grain again, as they have for centuries. The burned tanks have been removed, the trenches filled in, the bomb craters smoothed over. But beneath the soil rest the remains of thousands who died there, and in the memories of survivors and their descendants, the battle lives on. The largest tank battle in history ended over 80 years ago, but its consequences shaped the world that followed and continue to echo through history, a reminder of warfare's terrible cost and the thin line between victory and catastrophe upon which nations' fates can turn.